humanitarian act, and it is not in any way going to relieve the accountability of Israel for the crimes that it is perpetrating here. A ceasefire is the absolute minimum that anybody should be calling for. Happily, the UN has been calling for a ceasefire, but I don't think anybody should be fooled by these kinds of little theatrical measures like a 4-hour pause in the midst of the wholesale destruction of Gaza.
Another issue I wanted to get into, Craig, is before we get into the issue of genocide, is the fact that it seems like Israel is carrying out some sort of policy targeting hospitals. Hospitals are under attack. I don't even know the number, but I think more than half have been bombed, or the vicinities of them have been bombed. The largest hospital in Gaza, Shifa Hospital, is under constant threat of bombardment. There was, just before we're recording, there was bombing outside of the hospital and several people were killed. What do you have to say about the fact that it seems as though Israel's actively targeting hospitals? And is there precedent for this?
It seems rather unprecedented to have such a sustained campaign against medical facilities in particular. We've seen several hospitals destroyed, clinics attacked. We've seen the power cut off to these medical facilities. We've even seen the targeting of solar panels on the top of hospitals. That says that this is really an effort to eradicate the availability of hospitals, which I suspect is another way of purging those areas of civilians, because for so many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the hospitals were viewed as places of refuge. On the one hand, you've got so many horribly injured people who need those services. And others who have had their homes bombed out or living in terror, and they go to the hospitals thinking that it would provide some modicum of safety. I think that what's happening is they're being targeted in part for that reason. But I've never seen quite a pattern like this before. I know we're going to get to talking about genocide, but for me, this is another piece of evidence, because one of the very specific crimes that's listed in the Genocide Convention is imposing conditions of life that are designed to bring out a destruction of the population there. The systematic targeting of medical facilities is clearly a piece of evidence in that direction. It's not something I've seen before.
And then moving to the issue of genocide, I want to talk specifically about Gaza. Obviously, that's what's, the area that's being targeted the heaviest right now. But in your resignation letter, you noted that, you came to the UN in the 1980s under this impression that it was this very principled institution that had authority. But then you say today that under US and Israel lobby pressure, it's abandoned international law, particularly on this issue. And you write, and I'm quoting you, in a stunning historic irony that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the same year that the Nakba was perpetrated against the Palestinian people. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, we should do well to abandon the old cliche that the UDHR was born out of the atrocities that preceded it, and to admit it was born alongside one of the most atrocious genocides of the 20th century, that of the destruction of Palestine. And the reason I raise that is, I find it interesting that and important that this language of genocide in the case of what's happening in Gaza, I'd almost say it's become somewhat mainstream. At least it feels that way. It's being thrown around a lot more. People are discussing it in circles I have not seen it discussed before. But I do appreciate that you use that word to describe the foundational crime of Israel's creation against Palestinians. So before we get to the specific issue of Gaza right now, I'm curious if you could explain why you use that language to describe 1948.
It's interesting because 1948, there's a sort of a double historic irony there. As I pointed out in that letter, that's the year of the Nakba and the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, which is the cornerstone for the entire international human rights mission and the marching orders of the office that I have worked for 32 years. But there was a third thing that happened in 1948, and that was the founding of apartheid in South Africa. And it provides a very interesting historical illustration of what's wrong with the international approach to Palestine. In the case of apartheid, even when Western states were still supporting apartheid, the US was still supporting apartheid almost until it fell. But the UN had maintained a constant pressure on the apartheid regime in South Africa based upon international human rights, international law, and on equality right up until the moment that apartheid fell. In Palestine, on the other hand, that approach was abandoned 30 years ago with the onset of the Oslo process, where international law and calls for human rights and equality and so on were suddenly pushed into the background in place of this amorphous political formulation that promised maybe sometime in the future a two-state solution, deference to political agreement between the parties, which always meant between occupier and occupied that you were deferring to Israel in those situations. And so when you look at 1948, you see both the contradictions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Palestine as compared to the program for South Africa. And you also see the context for the genocidal assault on Gaza today, because this is just the latest in a series of ethnic purges of the indigenous Palestinian population that started in 1948 with hundreds of thousands purged from their homes, brutally massacred, raped, murdered, and forced out of their homes in a classic case of genocide. And then successive ethnic purges after 1948 in the 1950s in various villages, obviously in 1967, now again this year, and then the incremental, obviously, ethnic purges that have been happening in the West Bank and in Jerusalem all along as well. So you can't understand the assault on Gaza except by looking at this consistent pattern of ethnic purges against the indigenous people of Palestine that have happened all along. And I think it also reveals what the motive of the Israeli government is in these purges. Clearly got nothing to do with hostages. They're dropping bombs on the buildings in which the hostages are living. So it's not about that. It's not about defeating Hamas, as they often declare, because very clearly they know they're not defeating Hamas with these kinds of wholesale assaults. They know that they're building Hamas and other resistance groups with all of the young people being born into these horrors who will demand to have a way of resisting in the future as well. The only way to explain it is as a wholesale destruction and purge, moving from north to south in Gaza as a continuation of what has been happening now for 75 years in the country. So I think that historical context is very important, even in a case before a court for genocide being committed in Gaza now.
And then, right, and then moving on to the specific issue of Gaza. I mean, it does seem like there's almost a road to the genocide in Gaza specifically. I mean, when you use the word unpeople, it seems as though the people of Gaza have been more dehumanized than any segment of Palestinians across historic Palestine or the various refugee camps that they live in across the region. And I mean, just thinking about the last, 20 years, I go back to something that, and you might be very familiar with this, Craig, that Israeli demographer Arnon Sofer of Haifa University, he was the architect of this kind of current isolation of Gaza. And back in 2004, when he was advising the government of Ariel Sharon to withdraw from Gaza, and then seal the territory off with this horrible siege that's been going on for over 15 years. I'm just going to quote him real quick because what he said was a bit shocking. He said, "When 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe." He said this to the Jerusalem Post back in 2004. He went on to say, "Those people will become even bigger animals than they are today. With the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam, the pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, we'll have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day." Now, that was back in 2004, and I can recall every single onslaught on Gaza, what the Israelis refer to, as I'm sure you know, mowing the lawn, whether it's 2008 or 2014 or 2021. There's always a bit of genocidal rhetoric coming from Israeli officials. I mean, back in 2014, during Operation Cast Lead, there was Israeli Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, who referred to Palestinian mothers as snakes who needed to be killed in their beds so they don't birth more snakes. She posted that very openly online with no repercussions. And that's just one of so many. I mean, and then even now, you have Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, explicitly talking about, we're going to impose this complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We're fighting human animals and we'll act accordingly. That's a direct quote. You have Netanyahu referring to genocidal Bible verses when he announced the ground invasion in Gaza. I mean, I could go on and on. It's almost like the list is too long. We'd end up spending an hour just listing Israeli officials expressing genocidal intent. But in the case of Gaza, I mean, can you just talk a bit about why that qualifies as genocide? I mean, given everything I just laid out as well.
Well, this what you're talking about is the sound of impunity. Because normally you don't have people making these kinds of public statements so openly without fear of any accountability whatsoever. And that is a kind of impunity that's been built up over many, many years underwritten by the United States and by others who make sure that that impunity is a reality. I raised the issue of genocide officially in my letter while I was still serving in the UN, because I had never seen such a classic case of genocide, and I had witnessed the UN's failures in genocides in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Myanmar, and now in Palestine. But I'd never seen such a clear case. Genocide happens in stages. It's all a part of a kind of a planned effort to destroy in whole or in part a particular group. In this case, you actually have, and again, I raised it as a human rights lawyer, quoting the Genocide Convention of the United Nations, which lists a number of acts of genocide and then lists the required intent. You've never seen such a close matchup as this. You see, several of the prohibited acts have been perpetrated that are beyond dispute: large-scale killing, intentional harm, including physical harm to the population. This idea of, and those are quite common when you see, genocidal assaults. But then you have this thing which is listed, which is about imposing conditions of life that are designed to bring out the destruction of the population. You've never had such a clear case as that, as you do in the closure and siege of Gaza for all of these years, which is explicitly, and they have said so, designed in order to, to mow the lawn, to put the Palestinians on a diet, to make life in Gaza so bad that people will not want to remain. So you have an intentional interning of the population in a prison, what is effectively a prison. You have denying them adequate food, shelter, water, sanitation, healthcare, medicine, construction, freedom of movement, all of the things that are necessary for a decent life, as a matter of policy, intentionally denied to them. You don't often get such a clear case for the actus reus, for the acts that are required for the crime of genocide as listed in the Genocide Convention. And then you get to the point that you raised, which I've never seen. Normally, to prove intent in a case of genocide, you have to get your hands on all the dusty archives of a government to find the secret correspondence and see what they're really up to. This climate of impunity has produced something here which is truly extraordinary, which is senior Israeli officials declaring publicly on the record their genocidal intent. You mentioned some of them, but we heard it from the president, the prime minister, senior cabinet ministers, senior military officials, think tanks associated with the government, where they openly have been declaring what would be genocidal intent, proof of genocidal intent in a court of law. And then you have the context, as I mentioned it, which was successive waves of genocidal action, of ethnic purging. You have policies that are designed demonstrably only upon the ethnicity of the target population. So none of these policies are carried out against Jewish Israelis. They're only carried out against Arab Palestinians inside and outside of the Green Line. You have collective punishment, which is a typical act which is carried out in these sorts of things, which is beyond dispute and well documented here as well. You have forcible transfers. So if you were writing the Raphael Lemkin story of genocide, you would list everything that we see happening here. Now, the classic response of large institutions and of the UN to avoid, the problem with genocide is it's always very politicized, right? So it will be declared in cases where it doesn't exist because it sounds like it has a lot of rhetorical value. It will be denied in cases where it does exist because, don't get us into trouble here. I remember very well, I was working in the UN when the US State Department, a memo leaked where they had given instructions to all of their diplomatic missions as the genocide was unfolding in Rwanda, not to use the word genocide because then they'll be compelled to act. And now again, you see questions before State Department and White House officials where they won't even enter into the conversation. And the reason is because there is an obligation under international law to act to prevent genocide. So you can't say, as we often hear from the UN and others, well, genocide has to be determined by a court of law. Of course, every crime has to be determined by a court of law ultimately. But you can't wait until there's a court verdict in order to take action on genocide, because the obligation under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it's called, is an obligation also of prevention. And if you're not able to call it out, there's no way that you can have an adequate response to the crime itself. So this is an extraordinary moment in history where we see genocide textbook genocide, as I said, unfolding in real time. The evidence, beyond dispute of what is unfolding there. Statements that declare that demonstrate just how strong the climate of impunity has become. And then you have, just to finish this line, the obligations in international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and the obligations in the Genocide Convention on other parties is not just to respect that law, but there are affirmative obligations for the US, the UK, European governments, and others actually to ensure respect, to use whatever influence they have to get the crime of genocide from stopping and to get the war crimes to stop. Not only has there been a direct breach by these Western governments of that obligation in international law, but they've actually risen to the next level of legal complicity. And remember, the Genocide Convention outlaws genocide, attempted genocide, incitement to genocide, conspiracy for genocide, and complicity in genocide is a crime under the Genocide Convention. And when you have a country, for example, like the US, that has been providing money and weapons and intelligence support and diplomatic cover and even the use of the veto in the Security Council while these crimes are happening, that is a case of legal complicity in war crimes and in genocide, for which the US government should be held accountable under the rule of law.
Yeah, and you could say a lot of European governments as well. And European officials like Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, she's been one of the leading figures running around. She even visited Israel near the border wearing like a bulletproof vest and what looked like military gear, celebrating the attack on Gaza. I mean, in an ideal world, what would happen to these people? Like they'd be put on trial or they'd be prosecuted alongside Israeli officials?
There would be, absolutely. I mean, you would have. I mean, in the first instance, and I fully expect this to happen. At some point there'll be another UN independent commission of inquiry that will be mandated, that will investigate, that will document. It will come up with what we call the brown envelope, which is an annex that actually has a list of names of perpetrators, so that there can be judicial action subsequently. All the evidence will be laid out. I think there will be efforts to try to get some accountability in the International Criminal Court, which, as you know, has been dragging its feet when it comes to Palestine all along because of political pressure and its lack of independence in the prosecutor's office. But I think there may be some movement there. These are crimes of universal jurisdiction. You could have accountability in third state courts. If there isn't accountability in a tribunal, you could have a case in the International Court of Justice in the World Court, which is a state-to-state court that can have a finding of genocide that could then facilitate pursuing individual. It's not an individual criminal accountability court, but it would then provide a case for pursuing individuals in that. All of these things should happen, and we should all be encouraging it and supporting efforts for accountability for these crimes, including for those who are guilty of the crime of complicity. No question about it, because the whole international legal system rests upon the idea of combating impunity, of deterring countries and individuals from committing these kinds of crimes, because there's a likelihood that they will be punished. If we just allow it to, if we look the other way and allow that not to happen here and say, let's move back to the status quo ante and talk about this fake two-state solution, all these kinds of things, we can pretty much guarantee that we'll see continued crimes of this sort happening. So absolutely, there has to be a pursuit of accountability for perpetrators, for commanders, and for those who are complicit. And Europe, I mean, it's really an absolutely stunning thing. Of course, we've seen this consistently from the United States government, from the British government, but Europe and the European Union, and the kinds of statements and actions that we have been seeing, and the prohibitions against human rights defenders and peace activists, even demonstrating on behalf of the human rights of the Palestinian people and a ceasefire and so on, actually being prohibited in countries like Germany and France and so on, shows you the degree of complicity and what's happening. This is a moment in history that will be talked about for generations, and we will be all asked what we did at this moment, and there's going to be a lot of shame to be carried by Germany and by France and by the UK and by the US governments and by those who went along with this. But it's quite an extraordinary moment in history. We struggled a lot on human rights issues with Europe. Like, Europe used to be kind of the rock when it came to the UN human rights program. They funded it, they supported it, they provided political support in intergovernmental bodies. But Europe in recent years has entered into quite a contentious relationship with the UN human rights program because of their treatment of migrants, their treatment of ethnic minorities, waves of Islamophobia, and their action with regard to preventing protection in occupied Palestine as well. So it's quite a dark moment for the international human rights framework in political terms because it's being actively opposed. And
Right. Sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
please finish what
we
you're
all
going to say.
forever.
No, please go on more. It's good what you're saying.